links to both of those on my post-webinar email. As I mentioned in my email, there are a number of media folks that may be on the call today. If you have any specific questions afterwards, I'd encourage you to give our office a call. Dan will be available, and he's going to share our number at the end of the call, and our phone number is also in my signature line on any emails I've sent to you in the last couple of days. Okay, so just some brief logistical things here before I turn it over to Dan. So asking questions, there's two ways to do it during the call. You're all muted right now, and we're going to keep it that way just to make things run smoothly. First, you can use the chat function, which is on your toolbar, your GoToMeeting toolbar here. You can either address things directly to me, or you can address them to the group as a whole. I'd encourage you to do to address it to the entire group to allow any folks to maybe pile on if they want additional clarification on any points there. I will butt in on Dan's presentation when appropriate to ask questions. If you have a general question, I may hold it till the end, and I'll let you know in the chat bar if that's going to be the case. Also, if you're a little too shy to share things with the group on the chat thing, or you're just not comfortable with the chat function, you can always email me as well. You can simply respond to my earlier emails to you, and I'll put those in the queue as well to ask questions for Dan. One more thing after the webinar, as I mentioned, I'll send out a short survey about the presentation. We want to know what you thought. We want to hear ideas on future webinars if you have any. And also, one of the things we're contemplating this year is maybe offering hard copies of the Outlook for purchase if you're one of those folks that prefers a hard copy to an electronic version. So if you want to express your interest on the webinar, you can do it, or on receiving a hard copy of the Outlook, you can do it on that survey that I'll send out afterwards. To sweeten the pot a little bit, if you want to receive a PDF version of Dan's presentation today, you'll have to fill out the survey. When you submit it, it will direct you to a page that has that survey on it or that presentation on it for download. So that's it from me. If you have any questions or you're running into technical difficulties during the call, ask me questions on the chat function or email below. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan. We'll get started here, and I'll unmute you as well, Dan, because you probably want to talk.
Okay, does everybody see the screen? Am I up and online?
You are up, Dan.
Great. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us for our webinar to talk about the 2015 Outlook, which we've just recently published. There's a lot of friendly and familiar names on the list of people participating. Hello to all of you. You know who you are. I wish I could call you out individually, but there's actually too many of you. And for those of you that I haven't met, I look forward to doing that at some point in the near future. So as I said, we're going to talk about the 2015 natural gas outlook. And let's get to, that's where I need to be. Got to figure out how to advance the, there we go. Just a little preface about who the Northwest Gas Association is for those of you that aren't familiar with us. We represent the 6 natural gas distribution companies, also called local distribution companies, and the 3 large natural gas transportation pipelines that serve about 3.5 million consumers in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. You see the list of our members up there and a graphic representation of the facilities that they own and operate. As we move forward, I just wanted to take a minute to provide you, my dad is a retired professor. He's been retired from Washington State University since 1993, actually, and so I came up learning that you got to tell people what you're going to tell them before you tell them, and then you got to tell them what you told them when you're done telling them. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. The first thing I want to talk about is what is the Outlook. Many of you are familiar with what the Outlook is. It's a document we've been producing since 2004, so unless I miss my guess, this is the 12th iteration of the Outlook. It's a consensus view of what's going on in our part of the world. Our members agree on it. They spend a lot of time. They contribute the data to it and spend a lot of time agreeing on the messages and what we're trying to say in there. So it is a consensus view of the entities that provide, deliver, and distribute, if you will, natural gas to those 3.5 million consumers in our region. So what's new in 2015? Really not much. We did an abbreviated outlook this year because there wasn't a lot of new information. Some of the numbers have changed, particularly in the demand. Back to what is the outlook, we aggregate data from our member companies' planning efforts to come up with a picture of what demand might look like and how capacity is operating to serve that demand. We also try to talk a little bit about supply and prices. We're not going to spend a lot of time on supply and prices because that story continues. Abundant supply, lower prices. Relative to the demand and the capacity, we have modest demand growth in our region and sufficient capacity. But for every one of those elements, there is a caveat. So we have abundant supply, but there are questions about how that supply is produced and whether or not there might be constraints on accessing that supply. We have lower prices, but there are also caveats around that. Caveats that might drive the prices lower still, probably more caveats that might drive those prices up a little bit. Modest demand growth in our region also has a caveat. That's mostly on the plus side. Could we see large loads coming to the region? And we'll talk more about every one of these bullets as we go forward, and then sufficient capacity. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you what really we're all about as an association, and that's talking about natural gas really as a solution to our region's concerns, issues, from economic growth to environmental considerations and efficient use of energy and the like. We think natural gas is a primary solution for those issues in the region. So let's dive into then the presentation itself. And we'll talk a little bit here about abundant supply. This map simply shows where, and I know you've all heard the term shale. You are aware that shale gas, production of natural gas and oil from shale rock, is really transformative. It's turned the energy world on its ear. Well, this is where in North America those shale resources are. So you can see the current shale plays are the redder, and the prospective shale plays are in the green. They're outlined by some that are lower or older and some that are newer in geologic time, but you can see where these shale resources are. And some of you have heard me use the frame. This is what we're looking at here is really could be thought of as the east and west coast of North America 65 million or so years ago. So lots of shale and all throughout North America. And in fact, this slide really depicts that really well. This is the Potential Gas Committee, which has been in existence since the 50s, always every 2 years trying to take a look at what is the natural gas supply we have available to us in the region. So this is the total available resource. And you can see that starting there in about 2006, a phenomenon occurred, and that's the production of natural gas from shale resources. We've always known where those shales are. In fact, in many cases, they underlie and provide are the kitchen where the conventional resources are cooked. We've just never known how to produce them until the last 10 years. And you can see the dramatic impact of the available resource from unlocking those shale-based natural gas supplies. 125% increase, and I'll just add to put a point on it here. So this is U.S. the total available resource, but the same kind of analysis occurred in Canada, where the National Energy Board up there, in cooperation with the province of Alberta and British Columbia, did a similar kind of assessment. And in 2012, I think it was, they estimated that the total available resource up there was about 424 trillion cubic feet. assessment with British Columbia and Alberta, and actually in 2014 announced that they really thought the total available resource was almost 1,200 trillion cubic feet, so an increase of almost 250% because we have this, we've been able to unlock these shale resources in large part. And it looks like one of the things that we've seen and we comment on in the Outlook study is the fact that production from these resources, actually production of natural gas, continues to, perhaps astound is too strong a word, but confound maybe the projections that certainly there needs to be declines. And this slide simply overlays expected production. This is Energy Information Administration. Expected production of natural gas, and overlaid over that are natural gas drilling rigs and oil drilling rigs. The natural gas drilling rigs are in green, the oil drilling rigs are in black, and so you can see a very dramatic drop in natural gas drilling rigs. These are rigs devoted to producing dry natural gas, dropped from about 1,600 in September 08 to today. That number is just a little over 200. Which is remarkable. And then a commensurate drop in rigs directed at producing oil or natural gas liquids. And of course, that's as a result of, low oil prices, disinvestment in additional production while the low oil price regime remains. But at the same time, natural gas production is expected to continue to increase. So what's going on there? Well, the EIA credits that to having a large amount of, what shall I say, sort of inventory on the shelf, 6 or 7 months of inventory on the shelf, but the largest degree of credit goes to technological advances in production. So they're getting better and better at this all the time. So shale has had a huge impact and continues to. This slide, for those of you that participated in our first webinar a couple of months ago with Brian Morris of Spectra, you'll have seen this slide already. This is the supply curve developed by MIT in 2011, augmented since then with the Montney Shale in British Columbia and the Utica Shale in New York and Pennsylvania, with a better understanding of those resources. What this slide simply says is that about 11, let's call it 1,000 and change trillion cubic feet of gas can be produced at profitably at $4 or less per million BTU or decatherm. So there's a lot of gas available that can be produced profitably at a small amount of money. There's another slide that Brian showed that talked about, so how much gas is that compared to how much we're consuming. He incorporated gas consumption projections from the EIA, from Canada's National Energy Board, that took into account things like expected additional gas-fired generation across both countries, as well as a piece of LNG exports. And we didn't even approach this 1,000 trillion cubic feet. We began to approach it out in about 20 years. So there's a lot of affordable gas. That's not to say that gas will be sold at $4 a decatherm or million BTU, but it can be profitably produced at that amount. I just wanted to take a minute to point out where we get our natural gas supplies from: British Columbia, Alberta, and the U.S. Rocky Mountain West. You can see that in here. We get probably more than 70% of our supplies from Canada, typically between British Columbia, which comes right down the I-5 corridor, and Alberta, which comes through Idaho, eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and onto California, and the other 30% from the U.S. Rocky Mountain West through the two pathways that you see there, including the Williams Northwest Pipeline, which is bidirectional from the Canadian border and the Rockies, moves gas both ways, and the Kinder Morgan Ruby Pipeline down there at the southern end. So we'll get a slug of our gas from Canada, a big chunk of it, but a very important component also comes from the Rockies. The other thing I wanted to note is that in both of these basins, production is expected to be able to increase. Now, there's a lot of discussion around potential increases in British Columbia, in Alberta, and the U.S. Rocky Mountains West. That production has slowed a little bit, the growth in production. There's even some declines. That's not because the supply is not available. It's simply because it's not worth, we can't make money or the producers can't make money producing in those areas when natural gas prices are under $3 or $2.50. And so there's just not a lot of investment in bringing up the gas that does exist there, but there is a plenty of resource in all of these locations for the future. We're well situated as a region between two very prolific production areas. So just what are the conclusions we draw then from in our outlook study? Abundant resource, production exceeding expectations, and we're in a great location geographically. We also take a minute to highlight in our outlook study what we think some of the variables might be that could affect that picture. Certainly low oil prices, environmental concerns, environmental impact of production, legislation and regulation around production techniques, and production techniques that may improve over the years. These are all things that we keep an eye on that could affect what our essential conclusions are. Another feature we added to our outlook last year, and we really embellished on it this year, I think, in a really good way, is we've added a number of sidebars. So we have a sidebar on responsible production in our outlook study, and we'll encourage you either to download a copy for yourself, which we provide a link to at the end of the presentation here, and take a look at those sidebars in our outlook study. I'm going to pause for just a moment and see if any of you have any questions you want to type in via chat or email. I don't see anything that's come up yet. So, Ben, any questions that you've received via email?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, go ahead and type them in if you have questions on supply. In the meantime, just to keep us on track, I'm going to forge on into our prices section. So, prices. We don't model prices at the Northwest Gas Association, but we look at all of the work that other people do. And so just to be as informative as we possibly can be in our outlook study, we include some of what other people are doing. In this case, for projected natural gas spot prices, we really use two resources, U.S. Energy Information Administration and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which takes a look at natural gas as they have to assess natural gas prices because that makes a difference when natural gas is being used as a power generation resource. So the three solid lines there are the most recent iterations of those three resources. The blue line is the EIA, and then the orange and teal lines are Power Council estimates of trading points in our neck of the woods. So the EIA line is the Henry Hub, located in Louisiana. The Power Council's teal line is ACO, which is the Alberta Trading Hub, and the orange line is the Power Council's estimate of prices at Sumas, which is where we get the gas from BC. So you can see that our regional trading hubs have historically and look like they may continue to be traded at a discount to the Henry Hub, which is sort of the benchmark across the country. But in all three cases, we're looking at significantly lower prices than were estimated in, say, 2008, prior to the shale revolution, prior to the Great Recession. So that's the main point to take from this is we're looking at lower natural gas prices. The expectation is lower natural gas prices out into the future. This one contemplates 20 years. Moving on then, historic oil and gas spot price. I just want to point out here that the link has severed. This is not a phenomenon that's new to any of you on the line, I'm sure. But I would have you take a look at the very end of this chart, where oil prices ticked back up and natural gas prices did not follow. So the one could have said, well, maybe as we see a decline in oil prices, you're starting to see a little bit of an associated decline in natural gas prices. But I think that may have just been natural variations in the market. The fact is we're around that $4 mark, and it just doesn't get much lower than that on the natural gas side of things. So disconnected oil and gas prices, with oil or natural gas being an energy equivalence, on an energy equivalent basis, natural gas being a pretty good value compared to oil. And then just to emphasize that point a little bit more, because we are looking at and investigating whether or not we can build a transportation, build natural gas as a transportation fuel in the region. This is the Energy Information Administration's estimate of the fuel price differential going forward. So natural gas in a gasoline gallon equivalent, diesel and gasoline prices, you can see they're down pretty low here, but natural gas stays pretty low while diesel and gasoline are projected to increase. So while we may have seen a compression of that value proposition in the last year or so, it looks like, according to these folks anyway, that the economic benefit of natural gas as a transportation fuel will be sustained over time. Okay, so conclusions and prices. You can read those for yourself. I want to highlight for you what some of the variables are. Economic growth. If we grow more rapidly than we're expecting, that could have an impact on prices. The pace of adoption of generation, industrial, and transportation fuels could also affect prices. Infrastructure constraints have a huge impact regionally. We have got a slide a little bit later that shows some of that, but that's really drawn out in stark terms when you take a look at what goes on in the Northeast in the wintertime, where their natural gas prices can reach $120 a decatherm on a day, largely because they don't have enough pipeline capacity to serve all of the population and demand in that region. So that can have, infrastructure constraints can have regional impacts on prices. New or improved production technologies can certainly drive prices down, and there could be regulatory or statutory impacts on the cost of production. And of course, exports. I want to take just a second to talk about exports. There's a lot of discussion around that, and a lot of concern or consternation maybe over what is the impact that exports could have on prices. Most of the, I won't call it a consensus, but I would say a majority of analysts who look at this indicate that by and large about 10% of the U.S. production could be available for export, and that the impact on prices could be around 10% on any given day. So the impact is not huge. It's important to understand when people talk about, oh my gosh, we've proposed 35 or 40 billion cubic feet a day of export potential in the region, and that can have a huge dramatic impact on prices. It's important to understand, while all of those export terminals have indeed been proposed, not all of them will get built. In fact, I like to say that there is unlimited opportunity to propose LNG export terminals, but there is very limited capital on a global basis to actually finance the construction of those facilities. So just wanted to take a minute on that. And then on our sidebar, we've just got a little sidebar in there that talks very briefly about the impact of oil price volatility. This was a guest article provided to us by the Natural Gas Vehicles of America Coalition, so good group there. And looking for your questions if you have any. I'll just move on then into our outlook forecast. This is the demand side of things. As we're a little bit more robust in our analysis, rather than rehashing information you've all heard, this piece is where we actually develop and deliver to the region some original information. So this is our outlook forecast with the generation in yellow, industrial in maroon, commercial in blue or purple, and residential in the seafoam green there. By and large, our demand's pretty slow. It's about average of 1.2% a year over the forecast horizon. It's about 2.5% in the generation sector and a little less than 1% in every other sector. I'll just note for the good of the order that industrial demand actually has ticked up a little bit this year. Last year it was 0.6%, and previous years it wasn't much better than that. This year it's actually more at an average annual growth rate of about 0.9%. So a little more enthusiasm, I think. Our members are projecting opportunity there, and a little bit more opportunity in the industrial sector. But I think the story is our load growth in the region is really being driven by additional gas demand for power generation. Not a huge surprise. The organic growth in the core market, the residential and commercial markets, is pretty slow. This is historic demand. It's just a contrast with our previous slide on projected demand. A couple of points I like to point out here on this slide. One is the industrial demand there in the maroon bars again. Again, this is historic, so this is not weather normalized. This is actual demand in the region. But you'll see in industrial demand that we've lost a significant portion of industrial demand really in two tranches over the last 15 years or so. The first was with the Western energy crisis at the turn of the century, where we lost almost all of our primary metals industry, aluminum smelters in the region, and that had a big impact on industrial demand for natural gas. The second was right around the Great Recession, and there the primary tranche we lost there, we think, was probably wood and paper products industry, where older plants in our region were shuttered and the capacity moved to newer, more modern, more efficient plants that had been built recently in the southeast and the like. So that was point one. Point two is if you look at generation demand, the trend line is certainly increasing over the last several years, but it's also quite variable. As most of you know, I think, natural gas is certainly the fuel on the margin. It's the last fuel on and the first fuel off in our region, and so it's pretty variable. And you can see that 2011 year, when we had a big water and wind year, we really curtailed the use of natural gas as a generation resource. The only other thing I'll point out to you here is the last bar there, the one outlined in a dashed line, is the first year of our forecast. So that is what we would expect in a normal weather year. And two main things I'll point out. One, it looks like we're about right on all but maybe the industrial sector, which we seem to be underestimating. So it looks like our industrial projections are actually lower than what we're actually using in the region industrially, at least if you compare 2014 to our forecast at 2015-16 heating year. Okay. So I pointed out those items on the previous slide, and that just translates to the load. The composition of the load in our region is changing from 1996, where roughly it changes in any one year. It might have changed a little bit, but it always hovered right around 50% of the annual gas burn in the region was burned by industrial users, and about a quarter was residential, with the remainder commercial and generation. You can see how dramatically that picture has changed in 2014. And the key point there is all but the industrial demand are weather sensitive loads. So they will go up and down according to the weather, whether that's water availability, wind availability, or even cold and hot in any one year. Moving on then. Peak day forecast comparison, we also take a look in addition to annual load, we have design days. Now, we don't put together our own design days. Our member companies each have their own design or peak days, which is the coldest weather that they expect that has happened in the region. They try to put together, because they have an obligation to serve their customers, they try to plan for that worst case scenario. So each of their assumptions are a little bit different, and we detail those assumptions incidentally in our appendices. So take a look at that if you're interested in comparing what different utilities across the region do with regard to weather. But we add them all up and say, what's that peak day load look like in any one year? And you can see prior to the recession, the growth rate was fairly robust in peak load. Since the recession, we had a dramatic reduction in forecasts in absolute terms, and also, I think, a kind of a leveling out of the growth curve. So it's a little bit shallower curve than prior to the recession. So, Ben, any questions that you want to pose for me here?
You've got quite a few, actually. So why don't I start with the first one we received from in regard to climate change, some people believe that using natural gas to displace coal and oil consumption is part of the solution. Do you believe this? And if so, have you approached Governor Inslee on the topic?
Well, of course, we do believe that. And there are many of our members are working very hard to help educate policymakers like Governor Inslee and others about the benefits of natural gas. One of the things that I actually testified to before a legislative hearing is that we ought to be spending time and energy looking for ways to use this resource, which is abundant and available today, with existing technologies available today, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions today. And that's been the message we've been delivering on this issue. That's not to ignore the fact that some argue that point, and we've been involved in, or at least monitoring several studies across the nation that are in place to try to really assess what are for instance, the methane leakage rates across the value chain. So far, everything we've seen that's been scientifically done has been a good news story in that regard. So it's a big education process. So to answer the question, yes, we believe that natural gas can help in this notion of helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It can help today with technologies that exist today, and we're working really hard to educate policymakers to that fact.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And any other folks with questions, I'd encourage you to submit them right now. Another one for you right now, Dan. You said industrial demand is experiencing more natural gas usage than expected. What specific industries are most responsible for this uptick?
I don't have an answer to that question. We kind of take a look at it. The historic demand just comes in a big bucket. So this is classified as historic demand. We get that information from the Energy Information Administration, and I couldn't answer that question. Is Ed Finkley on the phone? If he'd probably be a better guy that might be able to answer. But I think you could probably look at the wood and paper products industries had a little bit of an uptick. Food processing has had a little bit of an uptick. And I wonder, I think I'm going to leave it at that and just say those are the kind of the primary contributors. There's glass manufacturing in our region. Everything's just been doing a little bit better as the economy has bumped up. But we don't have the information to really spell that out with any level of detail. That's pretty much conjecture on my part.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's all I've got.
Okay.
Oh, we just got one more.
Okay.
What is responsible for the revision down on this current peak day forecast comparison? Demand is less than expected. Why? I'm guessing that's between 2008 and 2015.
Right. It's frankly just growth. It's almost purely economic growth. we saw growth rates that were pretty dramatic prior to the recession, especially in the new housing market where natural gas was capturing more than a 90% market share in new single-family housing, and new single-family housing was being put up at really rapid rates prior to the recession. So our forecast has been revised down to reflect a couple things, I think, in the early years here. One is a using up of the new housing that was built already, and secondarily, I think a slowing of the construction of new housing, although we seem to be getting into more of a bubble today. But it's really just it's just that it's low, slower growth, economic growth than what we were experiencing leading up into the economic recession.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, keep those questions coming, and I'll pose them later on next break.
Okay, so in conclusion, in the demand section, modest organic growth, that's the core market. That's what we would normally expect to happen, but the possibility of dynamic load growth, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, and the variables you note there, the potential for large loads, again, which we'll talk about, magnitude and application of gas for generation. I think that's an important thing to, what do I mean by that? Well, it's the volume, certainly, but it's how are we using it? So are we building baseload gas generation plants or more flexible facilities? And the trend seems to be among our member companies and others to go, for the most part, to more flexible generation resources. So I'm gonna, and then there's a sidebar in there. It talks about the benefits of direct use as an efficient energy resource. Okay, I see. I'll just take a note here. A question from Sarah there, and Sarah, I think if you can wait for a few slides, we'll hopefully answer that question. Okay. So moving on, one of the things that we started last year was we put together some demand scenarios because we recognized that the way we gather data, which is through our member company IRPs, those integrated resource plans could not accommodate prospective or speculative loads, if you will, except in very roundabout ways. And so we knew and had a very distinct sense that there were developments going on in the region that weren't being adequately accounted for in our base data set. So we established what we called some demand scenarios. And we were way off the mark last year, I'll say. You know, if you look at the volumes that I have up on this slide, our coal retirement scenario was roughly the same. It was exactly the same as it was last year, but we only projected, I think, maybe 150,000 decatherms a day of additional industrial load, and you can see that we were maybe off by a factor of 10. Once we released our outlook study last year, we got a lot more clarity on what was going on in the industrial world, from general industrial growth to large load industrial, including export and methanol. So what we did was we developed these three scenarios for this year's outlook, and the 120,000 decatherms a day in three tranches, the general industrial, which are basically a number of smaller projects, still significant, but aggregated over a period of time, and then large load industrial. And we use the methanol plants because I think most of you are familiar with what's going on. 3 plants proposed for the region, each with 2 trains and an ultimate capacity of about 320,000 decatherms per plant, or 160,000 decatherms a day per train. Apparently, they may even revise those numbers up, but we'll work with the information that we have today. We also felt that that would be sufficient just to take a look, kind of a brief look at what's that do to annual demand, as well as what's that do to peak day demand. We felt that the methanol plants, because the information was pretty public, we could use that even as a proxy because it's close or proximate to what the loads might be in an LNG export facility as well. So the two are not exclusive. That's to say, if one gets built, the other might still get built. So if the methanol plants get built, there's still a possibility of export plants getting built. But we thought just taking a look at what the impact of one of those projects would be sufficient. Now we have a sidebar in there written by our friend up at Puget Sound Energy, Philip Popoff, their manager of integrated resource planning on natural gas and the EPA's Clean Power Plan. So we encourage you to take a look at that. This is the impact of the annual impact of those three scenarios added up. And what we found a little bit remarkable was that coal replacement isn't that huge of an impact overall on the region. The large load industrial plants would be a pretty big impact, and even the general industrial growth that we might see in the region could have a significant impact. So I'm going to move on to capacity now. This is starting to get to Sarah's question about how demand factors affect planning for gas infrastructure. So this is just a chart that shows the infrastructure in the region, the triangles being peak shaving facilities, typically LNG, liquefied natural gas, above ground storage that is only accessed at the very as the very last measure, typically necessary to serve load. The two stars there, NIST and Jackson Prairie, being underground storage for the region. And then you can see flows and directions at various interconnects throughout the region. Those are the capacities. This is just a quick chart. I'm not going to spend any time on it other than to say it's available in our Outlook study that shows the capacity of various storage facilities. I'll note for you that the Plymouth facility shows a capacity of deliverability capacity of 305,000 decatherms a day. That was derated for this last winter, and you'll see that in the supply-demand balance slides that I'm going to show here in just a moment, but it will be back to full capacity this next year. So you can take a look at that in our Outlook study. And then let's take a look at the supply-demand balance on a region. This is the peak day on the region, and you can see the resources added up there. You see what I'm talking about in that peak supply, the kind of brownish bar at the top, a little bit of increase from last winter to this next winter. That's the Plymouth facility coming back on board. And which way am I going? Go back the other way. Okay, or do I? There we go. All right. Sorry about that, technical difficulties. So you can see that for the next few years, it looks like on our expected case, we're starting to run up on a peak day. We're starting to run up against the system capacity. It's important to understand that these bars, the demand bars in there, are low, expected, and high cases. Those reflect an aggregation of all the member companies' expected design days occurring on the same day. So there's a little bit of a flex in here. Typically, weather patterns do roll across the region, so there's probably some flex in those bars. On the other hand, the capacity lines there, those reflect 100% maximum deliverability, so that's also expecting that everything's operating at full pedal to the metal capacity. So some flex in the demand, and we're delivering everything we can out of the capacities we have, the resources we have available to serve the region. The point of this slide really is the system is not overbuilt, and it's probably just about right today to meet today's needs. And this is the I-5 corridor, where it's possible that that weather patterns could occur more simultaneously anyway. This would be Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. And you see again, it looks like we're sufficient to meet the need, but really running up against it on a design day, which we've not hit design days in the recent past. By recent, I don't think any of our member companies have hit a design day in 20 years. I think I'm correct on that, and I'll count on my member companies to correct me if I'm wrong. This is what happens on a peak day if you add to it those scenarios that we talked about. Again, the coal replacement, and we're assuming that everything that's running on a daily basis is going to run on a peak day as well. On these lines, I should also note that this assumes that these demand bars include only those shippers with firm capacity. If they have interruptible capacity on the upstream pipelines, we don't count them. So we assume on a design day that they are curtailed. But here, and here again, this is our expected case. We're assuming that in the expected case, all of the loads that have interruptible capacity are curtailed, but we're assuming that everything that we put into our scenarios is running on these days. So certainly the generation would be running, and we're assuming that the general and large load industrial would be running as well. Okay, so you can see there that we begin to, now you start to think about, well, what's that mean? We're kind of getting through the flex that might be in those demand bars because we're starting to exceed system capacity on a real basis, in a real way. And this is a real world picture. I just like to show this slide. I'm sorry it's so busy, but this is what happened in 2013 and 14 on the predominantly the West Coast pipeline. So this area, the dark blue area that I'm tracing right here, that'd be a normal winter weather pattern. The light blue jaggedy area, that's what actually occurred in the 2013-14 winter, and you can see we had some significantly cold weather events, and in fact it was cold over a long period of time that winter. And you can see down here on the West Coast pipeline, which is the BC pipeline from production areas in Northeast BC to Sumas, that we actually they hit their physical capacity to flow. The other thing I'll just point out here is when capacity limits on West Coast pipeline were hit, we saw price spikes in the region. So back to that infrastructure capacity could have an impact on regional prices. These were day-long events or couple-day-long events, so it's not something to be terribly concerned about, although it is, I think, a yellow flag for shippers in the region. You could see Sumas hit $27 at one point. That's compared to, again, the Northeast, where they can exceed $120 and seem to do that winter after winter on occasion. So point is, these weren't design days. They were several heating degree days short of design days, but weather did impact the entire region from Vancouver to Boise and Portland to Spokane and every point in between. It was cold that winter for a long period of time. So we can have cold weather across the region, and when we do, we start to run up against the capacity. This is really a good news slide because that tells us that our existing infrastructure really delivered during this winter, which was a difficult one. Okay. So what you're seeing here now is a bunch of lines being drawn on, this is a facsimile of a chart we have in our Outlook study that depicts projects proposed to serve the region. The lines you're seeing that were just drawn were projects that were proposed prior to the recession. And you can see we had one export facility up here at Kitimat. LNG was proposed to be an export facility. There's now something like a dozen plants proposed for up in this area, all export facilities. And then 2-3 import facilities proposed for the region. But then the recession occurred and projects literally fell off the map. That's my joke. You're all muted, so I can't hear you laughing. But hopefully you got a chuckle out of that. And you can see those import terminals in Oregon now have turned around and are looking at how they can export. There are project descriptions for each of these projects that are listed on here, that you see on here in our appendix in the Outlook study. But that just shows that the infrastructure market in the region also adapts and shifts to market conditions. Yeah, so I will move on. And I hope I was able to answer Sarah's question when we were back on the peak day. Those peak days are really what at least the utilities look at in terms of planning for additional capacity in the region. All right. So our current system is sufficient for current demand. But as we hit cold weather, we're starting to hit the limits of the system too. And so we're probably going to need some new capacity as demand grows. And that need might be accelerated if generation and industrial demand is accelerated beyond our expected case as well. The type, timing, and location of expansions, I think that's important, will depend on what load is driving the expansion. I think I'll just note here, too, that I was listening in on Puget Sound Energy's IRP meeting today where they were talking about where they see there being deficient resource and how they might access that. And they did have a couple of those projects that you saw on the previous slide in there as options for their model to, but they also acknowledged that Puget Sound Energy probably wouldn't be a driver for any capacity expansions. It would be these other prospective large loads that are not part of our basic data set, but are part of our scenarios that would probably drive infrastructure expansions in the region. And yeah, the rest is pretty self-explanatory. So I just want to finish by noting that we have in our Outlook study, we have data tables in Appendix A that include all of the data points that drive the charts that we're responsible for developing. Some of the data comes from EIA and the like, but for those charts that are original to us, all that data is in those data tables A1 through 8. And then we've got the other appendices here that you see listed. And with that, I'll just conclude noting that we've got a couple of links down here where you can access our website for some of the resources that we talked about. You can also access the study itself there at that URL. And then, of course, if you have specific questions for Ben or I, you can call us or email us at these numbers. Any questions?
Dane, we have one here from Dave Hawk. With regard to capacity, based on your forecast suggesting need isn't the main need, I'm guessing rather peaking capacity is, such as new storage in the Northwest as opposed to line expansion. I'm guessing, Dave, are you saying is based
I think
gas supply?
I think I've got to see where Dave's going with this, Ben.
Yeah.
So that's what I tried to allude to in the conclusions, is that the type of load will really determine the type of expansion that needs to occur. If it's a large load, a large industrial load like a methanol plant or an LNG export facility or other, so let's say a fertilizer plant with 85,000 decatherms a day, those kinds of things that don't want to be curtailed, they could help drive pipeline expansions. If it's a more intermittent load, such as flexible generation and the like, that would be a load that is, I would say, more suited to probably expansion of storage one way or another. Hope that answered your question, David.
Dan, another question. You spoke about methanol plants and industrial demand, coal retirements, but didn't get into LNG. Any reasoning behind that?
Well, again, we took the methanol plants as a proxy for, it could be an LNG plant, it could be a methanol plant. The LNG facilities are, especially the ones up in Northeast BC, if you talk about the ones up in Northeast BC, they require a great deal of investment to come online. And most of the expectation is that there's a bunch of production available in BC that won't be produced unless those export facilities come online. So that kind of pushes us then back down to the south. We didn't leave them out, we just couldn't really buy them. It felt a little bit more to us like the like the methanol plants are just more tangible at this point in time. And we felt like you could switch them out. So you're talking about 1 billion cubic feet a day, roughly, might be a little more than that for an LNG facility. But all we wanted to do was take a look at what the impact would be. So if both all the methanol plants and an LNG export facility occur, you just double the increment that we added for our large industrial loads. So we just felt confident, comfortable with using that as a proxy for either or. I hope that's a sufficient answer for you.
Yeah. All right, Dan, another question for you here. How many total pipeline projects dropped off that map of proposed projects before the recession, and which ones were they?
Well, one of them was Sunstone and Blue Bridge, which was a combined project by TransCanada and Williams Northwest Pipeline, kind of a competitor for the Ruby pipeline. The Sunstone pipeline dropped off actually before the recession when Ruby was approved and ended up getting built. Those are pretty much competitive projects. The Blue Bridge has been re-engineered, if you will. It's now called the North Market Expansion, which is NMAX, which involves some capacity turnback on one pipeline and some additional capacity on another pipeline and some expansion south to north on the Northwest Pipeline and the I-5 corridor. So that's really been more of a re-engineering. I think the other one that I remember dropping off the map was the western leg of what used to be called the Palomar Pipeline, which would have served Bradwood Landing and would have the Bradwood Landing LNG import terminal would have connected at roughly Malala to then head imported gas east into markets off the GTN pipeline. So that western portion dropped off, and that was really the eastern portion, which was called, I don't remember what it was called, it's been like 7 names, but it's now called, or the new project proposal is called Trail West. There's still some compelling evidence that additional cross-cascade pipelines or cross-cascade capacity may be warranted in the region, and that's the Trail West proposal, along with FortisBC's Kingsvale to reinforcement project up at the north end of the U.S. So I hope that answered your question. There were 3 or 4 that dropped off and or were re-engineered.
Mm-hmm. Dan, one more question here. I think this will probably be the last one for today. Based on your background knowledge, at what price can the northern BC shale basins be drilled profitably to the producer?
You know, I think somebody has the answer to that, David, but I don't. I think it's under $5. I think I've seen a slide, what our friend Brian Morse at Spectra Energy had a slide that showed the Montney as being one of the lower cost basins in the region. So certainly under $5, maybe even around that $4 basis. But when you think about, while you could certainly produce it profitably at $4, you've got to get it somewhere to market, and that's where I think a lot of the expense comes in.
All right.
Hope that answered your question.
Okay, well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. I will, as a reminder, send out a survey right after this call, and we want your feedback, and it'll give you access to Dan's slide deck. I will try to get the recording of this online before I send out the survey, and you'll then be able to access that on our Outlook homepage. So you'll be able to access that through my email. So that's it for me and for Dan. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Well,